Well, this is some pretty wild footage here where Hamas conducts a close-range ambush against Israeli forces, one of them running out on top of the armored personnel carrier and throwing an explosive charge through the open hatch, which would lead to the death of 7 Israeli soldiers. Now, we're going to run through that clip in its entirety. It was all filmed and released by Hamas just earlier today. But I want to set the stage. Israel has already begun an investigation, kind of laying out what happened here. So from their perspective, military correspondent Doran Kadosh, again, some background before we get into the actual clip of this ambush taking place. He says the 7 soldiers killed were part of the Israeli 605th Engineering Battalion. He says, first off, the incident occurred during an operation by the 188th Brigade in Khan Yunis, amid a combat event in which a fighter jet was called in to drop a bomb on a target that was very close to Israeli forces. That's going to be important. He says, shortly before the incident, as part of the fighting, an explosive device was detonated and an RPG was fired at another unit from the same battalion, resulting in 2 casualties, one serious and one light. The battalion was in the midst of an intense 24-hour combat mission, during which the Air Force was also providing close air support for attacking enemy combatants. And this is where it gets into what the soldiers were doing in the vehicle. He says, according to operational safety procedures, when a fighter jet drops a bomb near friendly forces, soldiers are required to enter armored vehicles to protect against shrapnel or structural debris resulting from the airstrike. This is a familiar protocol that is carried out fairly routinely in the Gaza Strip. So the 7 soldiers, in this case, entered the Puma armored personnel carrier as required for a short time in preparation for the airstrike. And with that, let's go ahead and play the footage here as released by Hamas just earlier today. For starters, you can see just the rubble in Khan Yunis. More and more of the city is starting to look like this, and it can be a challenge to pick up individuals moving through that. We see clearly Hamas had a line of sight of these vehicles. It's not clear if this ambush was all designed or if Hamas at this point took advantage of the opportunity to try to do what they could. Now, from Hamas's side, they did put out a statement saying simply that this existed, that they targeted 2 armored personnel carriers near Khan Yunis. At the point of their statement, they said 7 total Israeli soldiers were killed. So no additional operational details from Hamas. But you can see they're already within probably a couple hundred meters of these vehicles. One question, of course, is going to be the security and what the Israeli soldiers are doing in terms of watching their surroundings. We already see them running out. I did see Joe Truzman. Those are Hamas right there running out. Joe Truzman mentioned right here that the fighter is dressed as a woman. Joe of FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, that we've had on the channel a couple times to share his insights. So Hamas dressed like a woman, clearly dressed as a civilian, surveying the scene. A lot of these areas have been evacuated at this point, so there's not set to be any civilians at all. And you can see, just based off the footage, like where would the civilians be at baseline. There are still quite a few tunnel networks all across the Strip. We'll get into that here in the second half of the video as Israel continues to dismantle those, but that's likely how Hamas came to this specific engagement point. And the question I brought up earlier is whether this is all part of a complex ambush. Maybe. We saw that earlier in the war, and I do have an additional piece of footage I'm going to play here in a second that it was just released. I think it might be old, but nonetheless, it shows a very similar tactic. And we've seen Hamas do this a couple times, but not enough to say that this is a tried and true method of their attacking Israeli forces throughout Gaza. Again, major question here is who's pulling security? What Doran is getting at in his earlier assessment, saying that they had to jump into the vehicle real quick. It's entirely possible that in doing so, security kind of became lax, unfortunately. Especially in the end of a 24-hour operation, it takes a lot to keep guys focused that long. You get tired and you get exhausted. But this is the actual footage of the guy running up to the vehicle to place the charge. So already some blind spots because of where that vehicle is parked. But you would expect at this point somebody in the vehicle would be able to identify this guy running up. They go and they play this a couple times over. Not only does he get on top, but look at that, the hatch is open right in through the top. And they're going to play this back. This scene is getting so much coverage on Hamas and pro-Hamas channels right now. Just right there, the clip of him lobbing it into the open hatch. They've got propaganda posters coming out. They've got just this video as a GIF, just on repeat, just over and over and over again. Now, the Israeli assessment that we'll wrap up here in a moment says that while the soldiers were inside the Puma, a terrorist arrived, approached the vehicle, and within seconds climbed on top of it, as we can see here. It said the explosive device was thrown in from above while the soldiers were still inside. It is believed that all of the soldiers were hit immediately upon the explosion in the very first seconds of the incident. Look, that's a very big explosive charge for a very small area, so it's entirely possible that every soldier inside was killed in the initial blast. And the reason that's important is because what you'll see in this footage here is that the vehicle clearly caught fire, and there was a pretty significant firefighting effort underway trying to pull this vehicle out and put the flames out. I believe they brought a bulldozer nearby and tried to cover it with dirt to see if that would put the flames out. You know, no matter what, you have to put the fire out, but, you know, hopefully there had to have been some hope that maybe the soldiers could be pulled out, but I think at some point after this fire rages for a few minutes, all hope was probably lost. Nonetheless, the initial investigation here by the IDF says that there were no additional explosives from the engineering force inside the Puma, apart from the soldiers' standard combat ammunition. The IDF is conducting an expert review of the damage to the APC, kind of suggesting the APC might actually be recoverable out of this. But nonetheless, the most important part here is not the vehicle and whether or not it's repairable, but the 7 lives that were lost. So Manny Fabian earlier today published the names of these fallen soldiers as, and my apologies in the pronunciation here, Lieutenant Yashinovsky, Staff Sergeant Ben Moshe, Staff Sergeant Rudia, Sergeant Shapiro, Sergeant Manarov, Sergeant Perlstein, and Staff Sergeant Davidov. So 7 in total killed during this one ambush just about a day ago in the southern Gaza city of Khan Yunis, which I believe marks one of, if not the deadliest single event carried out in quite a while as this war continues to rage. Now, most of the focus, understandably so, over the last 2 weeks has been on the fight between Israel and Iran. That entire time, operations have continued in the Gaza Strip. We actually had the bodies of 3 hostages that were successfully recovered a couple days ago. Israel says in a special operation carried out by the ISA and IDF, the bodies of the hostages Ofra Kaider, Yonatan Samarano, and Staff Sergeant Levinson were recovered from the Gaza Strip. This was on Saturday. They note that all 3 of those hostages were killed on October 7th, and their bodies taken back to Gaza and held by Hamas as a bargaining chip. I did want to play one other video that just came out a couple days ago. This one, I'm not entirely sure. Part of me feels like I've seen this footage before, but it does also line up with the earlier video we showed, throwing the explosive charge in the top of the APC. Another video here of Hamas conducting a close ambush of mounted IDF forces. Again, a part of this does look familiar, like I've seen it before, but it raises the same questions of how is somebody getting this close? It looks like they plant in the back of the vehicle, pushing the communications button, so that's how you would communicate with the crew inside for dismounted infantry. Looks like they placed a rocket on the ground and tried to set off the rocket at close range. Of course, the AK is not doing anything against the outside of that vehicle, maybe just getting them to move, but you would think in that APC they would just turn the turret or hop out and use one of the machine guns mounted on this thing. Nonetheless, shows Hamas getting right up against one of these Israeli vehicles, and I believe by the maybe we don't. I think we see an explosion by the end of this, but we don't. So, anyways, very similar to the earlier clip where we got Hamas right on top of the Israeli vehicles in the Gaza Strip. But take that second one with a grain of salt because there's a part of me that feels like it's old. I can't place it exactly. Nonetheless, the IDF has continued offensive operations throughout Gaza, especially in the south, and it looks like the 252nd Reserve Division has now completed its mission in the northern Gaza Strip. They've swapped out with the 99th Division. Now, what we've seen in terms of footage and releases from the IDF in recent days is kind of the standard that we've seen for a few months now. A handful of firefights, a fair number of overhead drone strikes and dropping of bombs on Hamas militants. Not a lot of direct fire engagement, but more. It's definitely trending up a little bit. Fair amount of IEDs, and then just a lot of tunnels being uncovered by the IDF as they push further into some of these areas that, quite frankly, they had not gone into during, if we want to call it, the first phase of the Gaza war. There are quite a few areas that Israel kind of pushed up to the edges of and maybe conducted quick raids through, but did not stop and completely and very, very thoroughly sweep for all of these tunnels. They're doing that now, and we've got footage upon footage upon footage of these tunnels being destroyed, explosive charges placed inside and detonated. Now, additionally, there's some news on the humanitarian aid front. This one, mixed news here is probably the best way to put it. There continue to be reports almost every day of violence at these aid distribution centers, and every single time that comes out, there's a lot of contention of who's responsible and what caused it and who actually did it, and it has become so incredibly murky. But one of the organizations that is continuing to provide humanitarian aid in the Strip is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Remember, this is the U.S. organization, and it sounds like they're having some success. They need some help, and they have recently applied for additional assistance from the U.S. government. Unfortunately, it looks like that application actually went through USAID, which, took some pretty significant budget cuts in recent months, and there's not a lot of personnel there to actually move this application through, so we'll see if this gains any traction. Nonetheless, according to some reporting here from the Times of Israel, they say the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an organization backed by the United States and Israel that began distributing food rations in Gaza, said on Saturday that people in the Palestinian enclave desperately need more aid. In a statement on Saturday, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation interim executive director, John Acree, said that the organization was delivering aid at scale, securely and effectively, but we cannot meet the full scale of need while large parts of Gaza remain closed. He said the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was working with the government of Israel to honor its commitment and open additional sites in northern Gaza. As part of its effort to expand its reach, the U.S. and Israeli-backed group has asked U.S. President Donald Trump's administration to step in with an initial $30 million, according to 3 U.S. officials and organizations' application for the money. So again, that application went to USAID. We'll see if there's actually people there to help push this through. The organization has not been completely dismantled. It was pulled inside the State Department, and a lot of the programs were set aside. Nonetheless, that does continue to move forward. The $30 million ask is notable because we've seen, in terms of U.S. or Israeli involvement right now, it's been relatively vague. We know that this organization clearly has the backing of the U.S. and Israeli government. Otherwise, they would not have the access to do this in the Gaza Strip. And they're, of course, coordinating day in and day out with Israeli military forces. The initial funding has always been a question of where are they getting the money to actually operate this, or maybe I've just missed that. But as far as I know, that isn't entirely known. So in this case, appealing directly to the U.S. government for additional funding. Now, one last key note I wanted to bring up. Hamas, of course, the concern being for years that if Israel ever attacked Iran, they'd have to worry about the proxy forces coming into the fight and attacking from multiple directions. Hamas being one of those directions, largely in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank. Of course, that didn't really happen in the last few weeks. By all accounts, Hamas didn't really do anything to assist the Iranian war effort. They probably couldn't, to be fair. Now, an interesting aspect here is, if you recall, the Iranian response to the U.S. attack on their nuclear facilities was launching 14, I believe, ballistic missiles at Qatar, and Qatar came out kind of upset. And we watched groups around the Middle East, a lot of the militant groups aligned with Iran, come out in statements praising Iran and celebrating their victory over the U.S. Hamas, notably absent on that one, which is kind of funny because Hamas infamously has a lot of support, financial and otherwise, from Qatar. So they can't exactly celebrate Iran, but they also, because the missiles went into Qatar, and that wasn't good. Qatar came out and said this is a violation of our sovereignty and kind of played that aspect of it. Hamas kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place on that one. So from everything that I've seen, they've stayed pretty quiet. But anyways, now as the ceasefire appears to remain in effect between Israel and Iran, it's entirely possible we start to see more information emerge from the Gaza Strip as Israel continues operations there and continues to expand their footprint, especially in the southern portion of the territory. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.